Okay, cool. So thanks for joining, guys. Let's see. So for this meeting, I figured just give some insight into everything that happened since our last meeting, kind of if there's been any issues that have been stumbled upon the way, and get some ideas if there are any, and stuff like that. So, right, last meeting, we went over the proposal, made sure everyone was on the same page, and then kind of, generated a number of GitHub issues and essentially work items to actually go through and getting OpenWhisk kind of more Dockerized and for running on Kubernetes. And so since that, the way how it's currently being deployed was it uses this hacky configuration image when deploying OpenWhisk, and we were trying to kill that image. So what I've been doing essentially is going from all of the Ansible rules backwards and pulling them out of that image. And so since last week, we've had a couple of days off here in the US, and I started off with Nginx, pulling that out. And so right now that's all been merged, and there's docs in the Kubernetes repo for deploying Nginx manually. And it kind of goes through what we had talked about. It walks through essentially generating at least self-signed certs that can be used for the Nginx image. It talks about HA controller settings that are coming and how to, they're already in it, but they're not able to easily be deployed on Kubernetes yet. But it talks about how when those will be ready, how you can adjust the settings properly to deploy HA controllers. And then it also essentially just gives you all of the commands for creating the Kubernetes secrets resources and Kubernetes config map resources for deploying Nginx. So I think that is pretty good. I don't know if either of you have taken a look at any of that stuff.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out, how to map from Ansible to Kubernetes. I personally am quite new to the cloud computing side. I was wondering if you can give some pointers to where the Kubernetes config files are. Like all that I can see is the properties and group vars. All these are the files where some of the properties are defined. But looks like the actual mapping happens somewhere else. In the Kubernetes, you take the config map, and how do you actually start the job? Can you give some pointers, or if it allows for it, the conference time?
Yeah, so let me share my screen, and it will be easiest to just walk through some of that stuff. So let me just write that down. That's a note. Kube. All right, definitely gonna have to go back through and edit all this. All right, let's see. Share screen is bottom. Sure, I guess hopefully I'm sharing my entire desktop now. All right, so I'll just do it here. go here, workspace. Get. Make sure we're up to date. Okay. So just open this up in Vim, make it a little bigger. So, what is this? It's not everything. There you go. Okay. All right, so for example, let's take a look at Nginx. So if we look at the Nginx YAML, right, this first part is the service, right, which is for Kubernetes. It makes it routable via other Kubernetes pods, and at least the way it's done for testing right now is it's got this node port type, which makes it publicly available. And as I'm saying this, I should note down that we're missing some docs. So I'm just going to write this down. And the doc, we need to document how to make Nginx publicly available to places that have load balancers, because Kubernetes can interact with some cloud providers and deploy load balancers for you, which is kind of nice. So I'll go add that to the issue as well. But all right, walking through. So for Kubernetes, you can create config maps and secrets, which are more or less the same thing. The only difference, I believe, is secrets are stored securely inside of Kubernetes. They're encrypted in the Kubernetes database, which is etcd. And I believe config maps are just stored as plain text, right? So all the secrets, right, passwords and stuff should go in the secrets, and anything that, you know, isn't need to be protected can just go into config maps. And what these things are essentially key value pairs of either environment variables. So you can set
so that goes into etcd, doesn't it?
Yeah, so it goes into etcd and Kubernetes. But then what you can do, so for an Nginx, so for example, this right here, well, pull up the command that actually generates these. README. So what you can do is in the pod, you can define a volume, which it's an okay name. But what it does is it essentially allows you to import the properties you want from a config map. And what it does is you can either mount properties that are files, or you can import those properties as environment variables in your pod. So for example, I have an Nginx cert property, which is of the type secret. So if we look through the README, there's this creating Nginx secrets part of the README of how to create it, right? And inside of it, it contains the certificates that you're going to use. So in the kube world, it's a kubectl create and then the secret resource, and it's got TLS built into the command for Nginx. And what it does is it creates this resource that has 2 tags with it. So in here, I reference the secret by its name, Nginx, which I give it over here in the README as Nginx. And when I actually want to use it, that Nginx volume, which is up here as the Nginx certs, I specify the mount path. So inside the container, under etc Nginx certs, it takes the secrets that are defined in this resource, which are these 2 certs. So it creates 2 certs, one as cert and one as key, right? And I've defined them when I created it as the cert and key that you have to generate for it.
So basically, you create some objects using kubectl and then try to access them. So that's the way it is done. Looks like.
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah, and so right now, I've got a pull request for the invoker as well, where I've removed it from the configuration image, and the invoker is just being manually deployed as a YAML file. And inside of that, there's a whole bunch of environment properties that are pre-configured, but allow you to change them. So yeah, I'm gonna have to go back, but whatever. Part of what I was doing last week is kind of setting up my local environments for testing, because I wanted to make a couple changes to the OpenWhisk repo itself. Specifically, I wanted to configure Nginx, or I'm sorry, I wanted to configure the invoker so that you didn't need to provide a console environment variable to tell it where to look, because you can provide everything via just straight environment variables. That took me a couple days to actually set up, because as you can see, I am using Vim, and like there's only a couple of lines that I needed to change, and I had never tested anything either with Java or now with Scala, and so I was kind of lost and kind of bringing myself up to speed. But I did it, and since then, it seems like there's a pull request that Roderick has created, which actually nukes all of Console from OpenWhisk, which is pretty sweet. So we don't have to do the whole thing. However, so that being said, since I was able to do it, I had created my own Docker image of the invoker that doesn't require Nginx to be set. But once Roderick's pull request for nuking all of Nginx gets pulled in, then we can switch back to using the public invoker image, which will be pretty nice.
You meant console, right?
Or yes, sorry, console. Yeah, so that was pretty nice, because I was thinking we might have to be the ones to drive that forward. But it sounded like he was getting annoyed with it, occasionally failing on Macs, which I had noticed as well. And so I also gave up on Mac for testing, as it was so much easier in a Ubuntu VM to actually run through all the tests. And so that was kind of the second part of what I did. for these last 2 weeks is kind of just set up my own environment for testing, so that I could actually develop on the core OpenWhisk stuff. Got that all set up. And then with this console pull request to remove all of it, I'm not even going to submit mine, but I just used the image I built to test that we can deploy the invoker without console, and that worked fine. But with that, I realized that there are definitely a lot of properties that need to be set on the invoker via environment variables. And the way that they're currently configured via Ansible, some of them are like composites of either predefined resources in Ansible or resources that you have to define in Ansible, or a combination of the both. And some of those environment variables I know will be shared between a couple of the components, like the invoker and the controller, and even the DB, right? Because like the DB password and username has to be propagated to all of these various pieces. And so it's kind of, I mean, we could manage it by hand, which is what I'm just doing for now, just to get things rolling. But I was thinking kind of in the long term, what would be cool is maybe we could use Ansible. I don't know why my screen keeps going like dark and bright. It's like capturing the light. It's really annoying. But what we could do is essentially have Ansible create a environment variables file. So I know in Docker, you can do like Docker run when you create a container, and there's a flag that you can pass it. It's I have it written down. It's env_file as the flag. And what it is essentially just a giant environment variable file. And then it reads in all of those environment variables, and you don't actually have to set them. But what we could do probably is essentially have Ansible run in a mode that either just spits out these environment variable files, or if you wanted to use it as it currently does, right, it generates this environment variable file, and then rather than having to set them all on each of the Docker images, it just runs it with that file as a parameter. And then in the Kubernetes world, what I could see happening is we essentially just create a config map from that environment's variable file, right? And because config...
Just one quick question. So when you say it reads from a file, you mean the environments cube, environments local, and then it has bunch of group vars and YAML files. So is that the folder that you're referring to when you say environment file in Ansible?
No. So I can actually, I'll pull up the code. Let's see. So if we go, not Kubernetes. So if we go, let's just go here to OpenWhisk. And if we go to pull requests, there's this nuke console PR, which is pretty nice. It's got a lot of files changed. And if we look for tasks, slash, what is it, invoker slash tasks. All right, so this is the right pending change to how the invokers and other things are deployed, like the controller, which is essentially all of the properties, right, that were in console are now here. But what I'm proposing, even a step further, would be to essentially create one file with all of these properties, right? And then instead of having, all of these environment variables, there is this flag.
Put them in the main Docker file for this image? Or?
Not put them in. I don't know if we want to put them in the Docker file. We could.
Yeah, I meant
set
through env file or something like you said before.
Yeah. So. Yeah, so there's this env file configuration. And so essentially all of those would just go into this env file, right? And when you do Docker run, you can just point it to this env file, which has all of those. But what I think we should be able to do is also have this env file work in Kubernetes, right? Because Kubernetes is, for the most part, when it spins up a Docker container, it's a lot of times just like a pass through for how do I kind of mirror the Kubernetes YAML to run all the Docker commands, right? And so this env file in Docker world is essentially a config map in Kubernetes world, right? Because a config map is just environment variable name and their value, or a value in like a JSON blob or something like that that you can set to it and then can be, mounted in the container. So I would think that if there's one consistent way of just generating this, massive file, that should be easy to take that same file and kind of convert it into what we need for Kubernetes. That way, there's like, what I would like to have, right, is only one place where you'd have to go and be like, here's this new parameter that has to be added for either the invoker or the invoker and the controller, or, any of the components. And if it all goes into that file, as long as these things are generated dynamically, right, everyone will be able to get that configuration change fairly easily.
I think what you're implying is that the use of environment variables is needed in order to support a standalone use case plus the Kubernetes use case, correct?
Yes.
As opposed to just putting all the environment variables into a config map and utilizing it just from Kubernetes.
Yes. I don't want it to be, Kubernetes specific, right? This way you'd also, right, there's the Docker Compose repo, which would also be able to take advantage of these generated files.
Now, I guess the one of the goals is to minimize the reliance on Ansible, but then you're talking about using Ansible to generate this file. Is that incremental, or do you still think that the Ansible will still play a role in the final implementation?
Right. So I'm not sure, and that's kind of where it'd be nice to get some feedback or kind of discuss, right? I think what we think the best thing would be, right? Because I guess it doesn't really matter from our standpoint, right? What I just really want is kind of some consistent way of generating these things. So it doesn't have to be, right? It wouldn't have to be Ansible, right? It could be essentially straight Jinja if we wanted to, or, right, I know on Cloud Foundry, right, we used Spiff, which is essentially just a YAML merger to get what we want. But if Ansible's already there and we want to use it as a consistent way of generating these files, that would probably be the place to start, is all I'm thinking.
Yeah, I'm not against that. I just was pointing out that if the goal is to minimize Ansible, introducing another dependency on it may not be the best thing, but there's also using it in order to have forward progress on some of the other areas.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, right. So that's the thing, right? It's like a nice to have because we don't need it. It's just looking at how big these files are getting and just
Yep.
setting all the environment variables. It's going to be annoying to manage by hand.
Yep. Great.
So cool. What else have I written down? There, right? That's to create. I think that's mostly about it that I was able to get done last week. Because I spent a couple of days trying to learn about OpenWhisk and how to run through all the tests and get everything set up properly. So I guess, are there any more questions?
I was wondering, is there any regression test suite or something for OpenWhisk? Or like other than just running hello.cmd or something?
For OpenWhisk itself, I'm not sure if there's like an actual integration test suite. However, I do know running all of the tests for OpenWhisk, a lot of them are actually integration level tests because they require OpenWhisk to be deployed before you can actually run through the entire test suite, because it relies on a file that has all these environment variables for how to target an OpenWhisk deployment and login and stuff like that. Yeah, so I was thinking of maybe trying to write something up and how to actually get started. But yeah, I don't know. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do there because so I updated, for example, one of the scripts that was done for the post deploy because there was an unused parameter. And now that we're running it by hand, I was like, oh, this makes no sense. Let me go and remove it. So I updated a couple of the repos, right, where I knew that it was being used. And then I was pointed to, a third, which I had never seen before. And I was like, okay, sure, I'll update it there as well. But then I was like, oh, let me try and run the tests here, right? Just being good, trying to run all the tests. And I wasn't able to run those tests because they require, it was a very specific test framework. It required like integration with like cloud services and stuff like that. And I was like, oh my God, I don't want to set all of this up, right? So even those tests I wasn't able to run. So I don't know. The testing that's currently there for OpenWhisk, I don't know. It seems not like you can't run everything locally from all the repos, which seems like an issue. So I'm not sure. I think testing is maybe a bigger issue that needs to be worked out differently.
So the basic test suite would be just like checking for some services and endpoints. And that's it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So in the OpenWhisk repo, there's the Gradle W, right, which is the way they use that to orchestrate testing and building and managing all the dependencies and stuff. And if you have an OpenWhisk deployed, you can do Gradle W and then it's test, which will run through all the tests. But you actually have to have OpenWhisk deployed and reachable locally for that to work.
And I noticed that in the incubator config file, you do start the services before you actually create the pods also. So if we have console, do we still need to start all these services, or are we supposed to use console to discover this?
No, so that's one of the things that I also found was kind of weird, is console was only being used as the key value store. They weren't leveraging like the DNS of console, right? Because this is why, so Ansible, when you deploy with Ansible, you have to know the IPs of all the VMs you're targeting beforehand. So at that point, they already had the IPs for everything, and they just provided them as parameters if needed, or everything is talking through Kafka, right? So everyone just needs to know where Kafka is. And so they weren't ever using that part of console.
Okay. So if for the case of deployment with Kube, can Kube DNS substitute for console? Is that a fair statement to say, or there are different functionalities?
Right. So it could. Kube DNS, right? So it's a bit confusing because the way Kube does it is to enable Kube DNS, you have to use what Kubernetes calls a CNI, which is a cloud network interface. And so there's a whole bunch of providers when you deploy Kubernetes. And if you're using DNS, you also have to deploy a CNI. Or it can also leverage the Docker network as the CNI. And so when you use console, what does it do? I believe it round robins. Does it round robin? I think it round robins when you make requests to like a console DNS. It round robins the requests. However, in Kubernetes, it depends on what CNI you use and how they manage DNS, right? Because all those CNIs manage DNS. So some of them, most of them, probably round robin, but you could have, some that cache things and then, send it to one place over another, right? So it's up to those CNIs to actually manage all of that stuff. So you'd have to read into which one's being used and how it works.
I see. Yeah, I was just wondering what it means to remove console. I mean, is it just for the DNS kind of service discovery or something else too? I mean, if it is DNS kind of service, it's just a bunch of adding the DNS records wherever the Kube adds its own records for both pods and services, right?
Yeah, but no, it doesn't do that. It only was the key value store. And it only did it for initial configuration, it looks like, right? There's also other things that you can do, like you can have watches on console, so you can like get updates if console changes, but I don't think any of that was being used either. So it was only for when a process comes up, talk to console and grab your config, and then you're essentially done with it in most cases. Right.
Isn't that supposed to be served by the API server when we combine with Kubernetes?
I don't think so. No, this is why, if we go back over here, the removal of console prompts the removal of adding a million environment variables all over the place, right? So everything just stands up with the configuration it needs and doesn't have to reach out to console. In Kubernetes, The reason I had a bunch of services is because I was still relying on Ansible to do the post configuration, and it had to know how to reach all of the pods that were deployed. So it needed, right, it needed some IP address to go and do some post configuration once it already comes up.
I see.
But now we're trying to build that into the Docker images themselves if need be. And so we really shouldn't have that many services in Kubernetes when everything is, well, we actually still will, when everything's fully deployed. For example, we don't need the invoker service anymore because invokers connect to Kafka and no one talks to them directly, I don't believe. So there's no reason to have that service with them.
Daniel,
Yes.
so that last statement may be challenged with recent posts to the dev list.
Okay.
So there's discussion about creating different pools for different types of requests, long-running requests that would bypass Kafka entirely.
Oh, right. You had actually said that the other day. That's fine. We can bring the service back. The way they're currently deployed is each of them gets a unique quote unquote IP address by all getting a unique DNS entry. So that should actually be okay.
I think the larger challenge is, I think the implication is that there's some type of different pool for different types of requests that will have different.
Oh, I see. So you'd split them?
Yes, that's kind of where part of the discussion is going. I think the initiative is going to drive it as long-running requests versus non-long running.
Okay.
But basically, it's being driven by that what's called I think the title's like API or driven use cases, just not that UI driven use cases.
Yeah, that UI. Okay, yeah, I know that was a long thread, and I was like, I started to look at it, and then I was like, oh boy, there's a lot here. I'll come back to it.
Yeah, Roderick joined into the discussion, and I think that they're looking at that concept now for long running versus short running actions.
So how would you distinguish an invoker if it's long running versus short running? Is there?
It could be a different pool, but that's the point I think that Dragos was making earlier was like, how do you predetermine these things? So it goes back to the philosophy of serverless. Somebody would have to pre-configure them or do some intelligent testing on the action to determine if it's long running or not.
Right. Or you could, if the API server could essentially determine the requests that are coming in, if it was able to just communicate to them and be like, I want to convert you to this thing, right? Maybe that's one way you could do it. And then all of the messages.
I think the assumption from Dragos is that, and I think Stephen Fink, the father of OpenWhisk, was basically that we'll have more of these types of use cases that maybe we need just to have a generic way of setting up these pools manually.
Okay.
And letting people, people who are setting up their platforms using OpenWhisk have some way of doing some scheduling, but the automation would be later, but a manual approach would be taken at first.
Okay.
I mean, something Adobe has is that they know that they have a specific need for UI-driven stuff. So everything coming from those specific URLs or from those services would automatically be routed to that pool.
Right. So that's fine. I mean, in the terms of Kubernetes, right? So here's the new YAML file to actually deploy the invokers, right? And it's got a whole bunch of environment variables. So I would assume that there's just one more environment variable that tells you the type. And what you would do is essentially just copy this entire file. And then you would come down here and change this name to like invoker dash long running processes, right? And you'd get a whole new pool of pods to run.
Right. That's what I had thought you would say.
Yeah. And then, right, you could do stuff with like making sure that they schedule to only certain nodes within a Kubernetes cluster, right? Because that's also up to the user for how they deploy all that stuff. So that's also manually configurable.
Yep.
So that's fine. Anything else you want to go over? Are there any more questions? If not, we can, I guess, just end this a couple minutes early. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Thanks for the meeting.
I know. All right. So cool. With that, I guess we'll adjourn and we'll come back in 2 more weeks. Get some
Thank
more
you very
work
much.
done.
Excellent.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Later.
Bye.